Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. On this inaugural program of our 8th season, we will explore the religious and spiritual needs of college students and the way one person in our community ministers to this age group. I'm joined by the Reverend Reggie Hunt, Director of Leadership and Development at Appalachian State University and pastor of Cornerstone Summit Church in Boone, North Carolina. Welcome, Pastor Reggie. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you.
I'm not sure I got your title exactly right. I think it's Leadership and Development of Student Athletes.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So I know you've been a long time member of the Appalachian State community. You were a student here, graduated in 2000, sure. And been involved with athletics and campus ministry since then. You have a real passion for this age group, right?
Sure, yeah. Sure.
What are, since you've been working with college students for so long, can you describe some of the needs, the particular needs, I guess, of this age group, their vulnerabilities, their spiritual development needs and whatnot?
Yeah, you know, when I first started working on campus at Appalachian, I first started in the admissions office. Mm-hmm. I literally showed up to football practice with a North Carolina Tar Heels hat on, you know, and Coach Moore said, we're going to have to get you with a different hat. But I started this philosophy of meeting people where they are, mm-hmm. And earning the right to be heard, things I learned from doing youth ministry. And every so many years, now in my 18th season with athletics, my 23rd season here in Boone, 23rd year here in Boone, every so many years you have to recalibrate because generations are changing. Mm-hmm. What I learned about the current generation is a desire for creativity. We have this philosophy that we use in athletics in our leadership program called EPIC. It means that we want everybody to experience, everybody to participate, that we have an image-driven generation and we want to connect people.
Okay.
So this generation is more image-driven. So the flannel graphs, the overhead projectors, you know, those kind of things are a little bit outdated. How do we kind of communicate using images, and how do we get people to an experience, because they no longer need our help for information. They can Google anything.
Right.
They need our help for interpretation. When you put that with spiritual development, which the health and wellness department on campus recognizes as a value and a significant part of the student's development, then those things kind of merge together.
I think that's an important statement. I want to repeat it and
Sure.
paraphrase it. Millennials, I guess, this current
sure,
generation, don't need us any longer for information. They need us for interpretation.
Sure.
So we're helping them be critical evaluators of their life,
Sure.
analysts of their life.
Sure.
And that seems to be particularly important when it comes to spiritual development. And
Exactly.
I guess that's where you come in.
Yeah, and I had this passion for it, whether it's in athletics or in church. Mm-hmm. I feel like when families drop their students off, we make a commitment to them,
right,
to help them grow and to develop. When I first started with my church, they would say 54% of college students, by the time that they graduate, may no longer engage in their faith. And we took that stat really seriously. 14 years later, that number is closer to 80%.
Really?
So we look at that and say, okay, we need to engage students and to figure out why that drop-off is happening. And so that was a part of a responsibility that we assumed as a community of faith to really engage college students.
So yeah, a lot of the stats and
Sure.
polls and surveys show that this particular generation is more apt to fall away from their faith.
Sure.
So I guess, is there a reason for that, or can they articulate why that's the case, and do you develop a strategy for
Sure.
reaching them where they are, as you said, spiritually?
Some of it is a lack of engagement, that maybe in some ways the church hasn't been as vulnerable over the years. Some of it is, you know, they have a lot of questions that maybe haven't had the space to be shared. Some of it has been, from what I've understood, to be looking for significance within community. And then you get to some of the other pieces of this generation is engaged in social justice issues. And if churches aren't at least discussing these kind of things, then there's a drop off from there too. And so where does the gospel and social justice meet? You know, those are conversations that we're having a little bit more that keep students engaged.
So students are coming to terms with their own development,
Sure.
but at the same time, their interests are different from maybe what the mainstream
Sure.
church is engaged in.
Sure.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing from you is that if the church is going to stay relevant, it's got to change its way.
Exactly.
It's got to acknowledge the creativity of this generation.
Sure.
Give them space to have their own voice.
Right. And
then to find what issues they are interested in, what they find relevant, particularly in this case, I guess, social justice
Exactly.
issues.
Exactly.
Do students of this generation tend to be more or less politically engaged, do you think? And do they see a connection between spirituality and political engagement?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about. I mean, you're talking about the first generation that could vote people off of a television show.
You know? Yeah.
I mean,
there's a sense of empowerment.
Yeah,
in that,
yeah.
right?
There's a sense of empowerment. There's a sense of their voice being heard, and I think that sometimes can be, causing a conflict because they are used to their voice being heard in certain areas, and so there is, and with social media, there's a lot more ways to express yourself. So there is a lot more political engagement. But in some ways, some writers that I've read have said that we are seeing some reflection and resurgence of things that we saw in the 60s. I'm a third generation pastor.
Right.
My father is a pastor, grandfather is a pastor. I have my grandfather's notes, sermons from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the Sunday after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Sunday after JFK was assassinated. Some of the things that he says, it's almost like they just happened last week.
Really?
So there's some similarities in this, in the amount of engagement that we see with college students, similar to what we would see in some of the 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
Just a personal note, did you feel pressure to carry on that tradition of pastoring and the
No, I got an older brother, and everybody thought my older brother was going to be a pastor. I was definitely more the unlikely candidate, but I enjoyed the local church kind of growing up, and I did not want to be a pastor mainly because I watched my father, pastor, and I thought I don't really want all that.
That's a lot of responsibility.
He was a pastor and a physical therapist, and still pastors now. And so I didn't want some of the politics that comes with, leading a local church. But over some time, God moving on my heart to really lead me in that direction. Did youth ministry for several years, and kind of emerged there.
Not only do you lead a local church, this would be a good segue to talk about what you're doing in the community, but you started a local church.
Sure.
Cornerstone Summit in Boone, North Carolina. You meet in a local school gymnasium.
Right.
Tell me about the church. When did you start it, and maybe what's it like? And did you start with the intention of targeting these same kids that you're working with?
Not really. When I worked at another church for 8 years as an assistant pastor, district youth pastor, senior pastor. When I started at Cornerstone Summit, there was an interesting group of people. One of us was Southern Baptist, one of Assemblies of God, a Presbyterian person, and me. Sounds like a joke, right?
Right.
And what we agreed to was like, what are some key values that we agreed to? One, we agreed to some basic key values on who Jesus is, His return, and some values of faith. The other thing that we agreed to is that we wanted to be an intentionally multicultural and multi-generational church. We never really set out to reach college students, but we were in our late 20s. There was this gap of people who had graduated and still remained in Boone that weren't fully as engaged in churches. And really, we borrowed some chairs from a local recreation center, and we were Sunday nights for some time and just kind of emerged. But we knew there's a scripture in Isaiah that says, in the last days, the house of the Lord will be established and many nations will flow to it. And that's where we got Cornerstone Summit from. Right. We wanted people to walk in and look around and say, God uses people like me here. Yeah. And so that was one of the foundational pieces for us.
And you've grown tremendously.
Sure.
How many do you have now?
Right now there's maybe about, on a weekly basis, maybe 200 people that attend. There's maybe another 200 that watch the stream, and that was an adjustment for us because we're very relational. We would like for everybody to be in-house, but there's a lot of people, I think, given units or people that come consistently, maybe about 350. Yeah. The first years we kind of grew. We were up on the main road, and when they widened that road, they tore down the building. That's what moved us to the school. But at that time, it might be 500 or 600. Every so many years with college students, it could be a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier that with social media,
Right.
there are now additional opportunities to reach people. So you mentioned live streaming your services, and then I think you index some services, and you have a blog,
right?
Twitter feed, and
Sure.
so you're reaching out in many different areas.
Sure.
Is this something that mainstream Christianity or mainstream religion is going to have to pay attention to
Exactly.
if they want to remain relevant?
Yeah, I think the church has struggled for a long time between remaining relevant and holding its values.
Right.
I think you can do both. I think you can hold your values and still be relevant. And so I think that's one of the ways that we understood several years ago to engage, partly because we had students that were graduating and they were moving to new locations where they didn't know churches, so they still streamed online. And that streaming also became a part of, and social media and all these other kind of things became a way for us to reach people. Something close to over 60% of people within a mile radius from our church say they're not people of faith. And so how do we engage them? You know, they're not always coming because they saw the banner and the sign. You know, clips on social media and those kind of things give us an opportunity. And that was a transition for the church, especially the church that I, grew up in as a young kid, where, TV was just starting to be permissible. Now live stream and social media is completely different.
I want to pick up on something you said, that to remain relevant, the church has to play a kind of balancing act between staying true to principles and beliefs, yet adopting new ways of doing ministry. I know when megachurches were big in the 80s and 90s, that one of the criticisms was that they were adopting too much of the secular.
Right.
But how do you maintain that balance? How do you make sure that what you're offering is not just another version of secular entertainment or secular offerings outside of the church?
That's a good question. I don't know if you can keep up with the creativity of secular imagery. Right. Movies and whatnot. Though the church has tried. I think for us, it's a matter of knowing who we are, and being true to our identity as a church. I think part of the other thing that we have learned from it is the relevance. Some things the church has done over a lot of years based on patterns of our church history. For example, the Dutch Reformed Church was a part of the apartheid. They had this kind of laissez-faire, attitude towards things. And so the question that the church faces a lot is, should we engage? And at the same time, to be the salt and light of the earth, salt works on contact. So if we don't engage, how can we be the salt and light of the earth? And how can we have a laissez-faire attitude towards things that are happening in our world? So part of it is, spending some time at a Mennonite Brethren church, even though I'm not Mennonite Brethren, and having our Amish brothers and sisters, who were a different graft of that, have chosen not to engage in certain parts of society. In doing that, sometimes you do lose a level of relevance. Now, if that's your theology, great, but in order to engage in a generation, there has to be some way that we do just that, we engage. And most of the things that we, argue are values, sometimes aren't always biblical values, they're more cultural values. And one of the best things for me was, I was the first in my family to travel outside the country. And to be able to travel outside the country and to hear how the gospel is being preached and the results of it took me outside of a Southern African-American culture and exposed me to more.
Right. And one of the most important and interesting things I find about your church, and I'd like for you to speak to this, is your insistence that the church community needs to be multiracial, multi-ethnic. I know many people have said this, but I think Martin Luther King Jr. maybe said it the most, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in American culture. And that still tends to be the case. Yet somehow in Cornerstone Summit, you've managed to attract a multiracial congregation. I think that's remarkable. Is there anything in particular you've done intentionally to build that kind of community? Or
Absolutely. First, I think it is a part of our theology. Again, going back to the scripture in Isaiah 2, the house of the Lord will be established. Many groups will flow to it. The word there being many ethnic groups, will flow to it. Tells me that God recognizes the uniqueness of individuals. The same thing with John, when he writes about Revelation and says they were from every tribe, kindred, and spirit,
Right.
around the throne of God. I think that theologically, that God is not colorblind, that our differences are brought together by the cross. So therefore, it wasn't an option for me. I grew up in a traditional black church, oldest black denomination, in the nation.
Right.
If you were to come to the churches that I grew up in, they would accept you. They would not be intentional about you.
Right.
The churches I grew up in, we lived in an all-white neighborhood, and only black family. The churches I went to for youth group, they were accepting but not intentional. So we had to be intentional with our worship. We had to be intentional with our leadership. We had to be intentional with our efforts, our relationships, in order to establish that type of church. And everybody told me, you need to go to Winston-Salem, you need to go to Charlotte, you need to go to somewhere else,
Right.
or Boone doesn't have that much representation, but we don't do that with anything else.
Right.
I could guarantee you I could play certain songs in that stadium that everybody would rally around. We rally around music, but we haven't rallied around faith. And I just didn't think that when we got to heaven that we would be segregated. I didn't think that still don't think that God is colorblind.
Right.
I take a lot of heat for it from different times, especially in more recent years.
It's not exactly a politically correct
It's not
theology.
politically. No, it's not. I mean, I think certain seasons it's good, but with some of the things that we walked through in our nation recently, between shootings and shootings in schools, shootings in streets, police, all these other kind of things, political debates, then race, kind of flares up. So it hasn't been the most popular thing to do, and the easiest churches, from my understanding, to pastor were the churches where you picked one demographic and worked on it.
Sure.
Cross-cultural churches were very difficult, and the fastest growing cross-cultural churches in America are led by white males. So doing that as an African-American male in Boone, North Carolina, is not always easy, but it's a conviction that I have.
Well, I like the distinction you made. You said that whereas most churches would probably be accepting of racial diversity, they're
Right.
not intentional.
Right.
So things aren't going to change without that intentionality.
Yeah.
So that's really, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of a challenge to the mainstream church, right?
Sure.
I mean, this is what the mainstream church, from your theological perspective, needs to get out there and get busy.
Sure.
Doing. Do you think it's going to happen? I mean, do you think the church can be a source of racial healing in this country, or?
I think, honestly, Doc, that the church has to. I don't feel that God has given any other entity the authority to do so. I think that right now we're seeing a reflection of things that we've done for years. The book several years ago, Divided by Faith, The History of Racism in Evangelical America, brought that out. For years we had, even going back to slavery, slaves in the church with slave owners, and we said one message to the slave owner and one message. We still do that now. There's campus ministries that would still offer me a job with the black version of the campus ministry, as opposed to just integrating the ministry. I don't know if any other entity has been given the sovereign authority to lead that. The government cannot do that. Even Denzel Washington said, you can write laws to legislate, but you can't legislate love. The church has given the authority. The local church has been given the authority to do that, and I think that no other entity can do that except for the church.
You really, I mean, this is a prophetic message, not prophecy in the sense that you're challenging social structures, even challenging religious structures. There was I was listening to your sermon I think it was just this past Sunday, and one line struck me.
Thanks for listening, by the way.
Yeah, no, that's right. You said, religion has taught you X, but God says.
Sure.
That's a prophetic message, right, which distinguishes between I guess, spirituality and
Sure.
religion as an institution.
Sure.
And it seems to me that what you're doing is challenging, in a prophetic way, some of the structures that religious institutions are built upon or are hiding behind. Maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think that, and I would be interested in picking your brain more because
Sure.
I respect your years of teaching. When I read the Gospels, I see things that I think the church just commonly overlooks. Mm-hmm. So, for example, not to get into a preaching message, but for example, the Good Samaritan. There's a lot of social constructs and social issues in that one passage
right.
that we have in some ways Samaritanized, the minorities.
Right.
Right. Jesus had just been rejected by the Samaritans, mm-hmm. and he engages in this conversation with this illustration, and in that he talks about a priest who overlooks it. He talks about different people who respond different ways,
right.
And he is very clear in recognizing this Samaritan, and this social and racial construct. I think the gospel calls us to that, and I think that if our culture is stronger than our gospel, is it really a gospel? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if it's not a gospel for everybody, is it really a gospel?
Right.
So the Bible teaches us things like to deny ourselves, to consider others better than ourselves, to consider how we can empower with our power, all of these kind of things. And so there is a charge to the church. And over the last couple of years, I have many friends in predominantly white churches that have come to me and said, how can we do this? And I said, it's not too late, but you still have to do it. But the motivation should not be, a shooting in Charleston.
Right.
That was terrible. I mean, I grew up in an AME church. So one, an AME church being shot, and two,
yeah.
A guy walking in when we meet at a school where there's no security parameters. You can't carry in a school. That's one of my biggest nightmares, is that situation right there.
Right.
But
even in a community that seems to be as safe and as Boone. Yeah.
And we've had to remove people before for things, not any dangerous things, but threats and
really?
Things like that. Yeah. So those things happen in Boone.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
So I've got just one last comment.
Sure.
I can't believe we're out of time. I've been fascinated. Sure. I wanted to ask you about the denominational status of your church.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you about your worship style,
Sure.
but maybe you'll have to come back.
I'd love to.
But I just wanted to end by saying thank you for the work you're doing at ASU
Sure.
and in the community as a bivocational minister.
Yeah.
I think it shows real commitment, and you're consistent across
Thank
that
you.
in your service to young people in the community. But thank you for your service, and thank you for providing a model for a religious organization that is intentional about addressing some of these underlying social justice issues in our culture. And we'll have you back sometime.
I'd love to be back, and I'd love to talk more about it. I think both entities, ASU and the local church, are engaging in these things, at a time that is really needed.
Well, thank you, Reggie.
Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it. Well, that's it for this time on Religion and Life. Thank you for joining us here at AppTV. I want to thank again my guest, Reggie Hunt, for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. Join us next week when our guest will be Dr. Randy Reed, who will discuss artificial intelligence and spirituality. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.